Hello, I'm Deborah Macbeth, Director of Communications and Engagement for Catch the Next, and I'd like to welcome you to the first webinar in our John Siceloff Journalism series. These webinars will be made available to Catch the Next classrooms across the state and also will be used as part of the training for our journalism internship, which was created in 2016 to honor the founder of Catch the Next, John Siceloff. John began his career as a freelance television producer and journalist, reporting from locations worldwide. He became a war correspondent covering the Civil War in El Salvador for CBS News and the Contra War for NBC News. John also was a top producer for news magazine programs such as ABC's 2020 and NBC's Dateline. In 2001, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, John created the show Now with Bill Moyers at PBS. He was the show's executive producer until he retired from television in 2009. John received many awards during his career, including 6 national Emmys and the Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Television Political Journalism. In 2009, John founded Catch the Next. Today, we are honored to have a friend of John's, Julia Preston, presenting our webinar. Julia is currently a contributing writer covering immigration at the Marshall Project, a nonprofit newsroom focusing on criminal justice. Previously, she worked for 21 years at the New York Times, including 10 years covering immigration. Before that, she was a Times correspondent in Mexico. With 3 other Times reporters, she won the 1998 Pulitzer Prize for reporting on international affairs for a series on drug corruption in Mexico. In her presentation, Julia will answer the question, why do I want to write like a journalist? Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. So our webinar today is going to answer the question that Deborah posed. Why do I want to write like a journalist? Why would anyone want to write like a journalist? So before I start, I just want to tell you a little bit about John Siceloff and why I'm so pleased to be honoring his memory in part by giving this webinar. So let's look at John. Could we have the next slide, please? John and I became friends in El Salvador when we were both covering the war, the Civil War in that country in the 1980s. And this is a photo of John on the right side there. The man on the left was a young Salvadoran journalist who worked with John. And this is a photo that's taken behind guerrilla lines, behind the lines of the guerrilla forces in the Civil War in El Salvador. And this is the kind of reporting that John did, very intrepid, very honest, and taking a lot of risks to get the story and bring it back in a fair and thorough way for American viewers of television. And watching John work in those days, I gained tremendous respect for his work. I want to show you in the next slide a photograph that John took. So this is a photograph of a young boy who was recruited by the guerrilla fighters in El Salvador, as you can tell, at a very young age. And John was not a photographer, but he was a producer. He didn't make the camera run himself. He worked with cameramen and photographers to get the images. But this was a picture he took himself, and I think it's very expressive of the kind of journalism that John did. He gives you such a strong sense of the tenderness of this young man and his pride in holding the walkie-talkie and his interest in the events that are going on. And yet this is a young boy who really shouldn't be involved in a war. And so this is the kind of very complex, very humane journalism that John did. So now let's go on to answer a question. about why you want to write for a journalist. Well, here let's look at a story that's actually a breaking news story, and this is the story about an African American woman who was shot in her own and killed in her own home by a Fort Worth policeman on October in early October. So let's look at what is involved with this breaking news story. Let's go to the next slide. Why are we looking at this story? Why am I bringing you this story to talk about? Well, obviously it's very important news. It's a complicated story. There are known facts. We know that the woman was shot and killed. We know that a policeman fired the single shot that killed the woman. But there's still a lot of unknowns in this story. Why did he do it? What happened? What is the explanation from his side, from the family side? Are there witnesses? There's still a lot of that is not known at the time that we're making this webinar. Also, this is a story that's very complex and has many perspectives involved. You have the perspective of the victim's family, terribly hurt and angry, and at this terrible event. The woman was sitting in her home playing a video game with a nephew, and this policeman shot her through her own window. But so there's the action of the police officer. What happened there? You have the police department. What is the attitude of the police department towards this? The community, how is the community reacting? And the larger city of Fort Worth, how do they view what this means about the police department, that this terrible incident took place? And it's a very emotional story, very high emotions on all sides. People aggrieved, people grieving for the loss of this woman who did nothing but sit in the living room of her own house. Their emotions around this story are running very high. And so this is where the work of the journalist comes in. So let's take a look at it. How does the story begin? A news story, a breaking news story, that's to say, a story that a journalist is writing about a news event that is unfolding and happening right at that time, starts with what we call the lead. And in journalism, we spell that LEDE. Well, is that the right way you spell the word lead, as in something that's leading, something that's at the front? Well, no, it's not. So why are journalists misspelling this word? Well, this is jargon. I'm just sharing with you a little bit of inside shop talk here. This is jargon that comes from decades-old language that has been used in newsroom to describe the first paragraph or the first few paragraphs of a news story. I'm not encouraging you to spell the word lead in this fashion all the time. And the lead of the story summarizes very concisely, very tightly, the most important news in the story. And the lead can be, often it's just one paragraph, but it can be more than one paragraph. It could be one or two paragraphs, but it's not normally more than that. It's a very tight, brief, and to the point summary of what is the news of the day. So let's go look at this lead again. So how do you write? How does the journalist write a news lead? Well, for one thing, I know this may seem obvious, but you have to think before you write. Why is this? Because in a news story, before you write it, you have to decide what is the most important news in the story. You can't tell the news in the story in the third to last paragraph. You need to tell, in a breaking news story, the news right at the top of the story, which means that you have to make a decision about what is the most important thing that happened that you are telling people about. You have to check and confirm all the facts to be sure they are accurate. You can't just spill down on the page anything that comes to your mind or that you think must be right. So On one hand, you need to move quickly, but on the other hand, you need to learn to be sure and check and confirm that the facts you are giving to the reader and to public are accurate and correct. You have to be ready to write a good lead, to cite the source. People don't want to get the information from the journalist. They want to get the information from a source who knows, who has expertise, who has knowledge, who is a witness. And so you have to cite the source. You have to be ready to cite the source of your information when you write your lead. And as you become a skilled journalist, you have to learn to write quickly. You need to learn to write fast, and you need to learn to keep it very short. No loose words, no extra language, no flashy stuff. You're just giving people the facts. So that's how you write a news lead. Let's go back and look at the lead that we just saw on this story in the next slide. Yes, so let's look at this lead again. The Fort Worth police officer who shot and killed a 28-year-old woman as she was playing video games with her nephew in her home resigned only hours before he was going to be fired, the authorities said on Monday. So let's, in the next slide, we have a list of all the information that was in that paragraph. Just think about it for a minute. It's one paragraph. What did we learn? We learned the main news of the day. The police officer resigned. We learned that the police officer is from the police force in Fort Worth. We learned that he shot and killed a woman. We learned that she's 28 years old. We learned that she was playing video games with her nephew in her own home. We found out that the police officer was about to be fired when he resigned. And there's a source. In this case, it's a kind of a generic source, but it gives us confidence that it's official information. It's coming from official law enforcement authorities, as cited in this at the end of the lead. The authorities are giving this all of this information. So that's one paragraph with a lot of information. Let's go on here. What's going to come next in this story, in a news story? Well, very quickly, you're going to develop the facts of the story. This is factual information that you have confirmed. It's not because you heard it from your neighbor or your brother or somebody happened to mention it on the street. You have gone to a reliable source and they have provided you with information, and if possible, you have double checked that. In some cases, you don't need to do that depending on how good the source is, but you are going to be developing facts in the story. You're going to be quoting the people involved. The reader of this story doesn't want to hear from you particularly. They want to hear as much as possible. They want to know that the journalist is quoting the people who were involved who actually know what happened. And you're going to be reporting different perspectives. So you're acknowledging that different people in this situation are going to be seeing the story from different angles, and you need to get them all included in your story to be able to give the most complete view possible of the event and how different people are seeing it. So let's keep going here. All right, so here's what happens. We don't need to read this whole thing, but the next paragraph that we're going to come to, we hear from Ed Krause, the Fort Worth police chief, and he identifies the name of the officer as Aaron Dean and said he had been with the department since April 2018. So this is an officer who hasn't been on the force very long. He said the department had launched a criminal investigation into the shooting and that he expected, open quote, open quote, substantial update, close quote, on the case by Tuesday. And then we go down further, and then we hear about the family. The family says her family on Monday demanded answers and said the officer should face criminal charges. And then we have a quote from Mrs. Jefferson's brother. And he says, "This man murdered someone. Miss Jefferson's brother, Darius Carr, said at a news conference on Monday, he should be arrested. The family also demanded that an outside agency investigate the shooting. So we heard from the police and the police chief, and then we also heard from the family of the victim. You have Mrs. Jefferson's brother, very aggrieved, very angry, and calling for the criminal arrest of the police officer who shot their family member. And just in this very brief quote that you get, you have a sense of the anger and the frustration and the shock of the family members who lost their sister, their daughter, their mother in this terrible incident. All right, so let's look what we found out in these 5 paragraphs. Let's go to the next slide. All right, it's just 5 paragraphs, but let's think about all the things that we heard. Lots of facts. We had viewpoints from the family and the police. The story is told in very simple, straightforward, plain language. It's easy to understand. There's nothing in the language that stops you up or makes you wonder, why is this word there or what does it mean? You're not hearing from the reporters. There's no opinion at all from the reporters. It's just the facts. And there's one thing missing so far in this story, which hopefully some of you have identified, which is so far we haven't heard really the perspective of the officer. But we know a lot about this situation, and this is just one story in a developing and breaking news story, so presumably we'll hear a lot more as time goes on. But the tremendous advantage of this kind of writing for this type of situation is that the reporter is not involved. Whatever the emotions that the reporter might be feeling about this story, that's not the job of the journalist. The job of the journalist is to have a clear-eyed view and give the facts so that people in the community can see what they think about what happened. All right, well, now let's look at another kind of story. This is a daily news story. So what's the difference? This is not a news event that is unfolding, that's going forward, where there's breaking news, as we call it, ongoing. This is it's a news story, but it's about one event that happened on a specific day, and then it was over. In this case, it was about President Trump visiting a border wall near San Diego as part of his campaign to get a wall built along the border. And this was written by my former colleague from the New York Times, a journalist named Peter Baker, who is, in my view, one of the great living journalists in the United States today. He's really a fantastic reporter. So let's see what he wrote. One thing President Trump loves about his job is signing his name. He relishes signing executive orders, letters to foreign leaders, and even read "Make America Great Again" hats. But on Wednesday, he signed a wall. All right, let's go and think about that lead for a minute at the next slide. Okay, this is a different kind of news lead. It's still giving you the news, right? On Wednesday, he signed a wall. So you still have the news, but this is a more narrative approach to writing the lead. He sets the scene. President Trump affixed his distinctive signature to one of the steel slats that have risen just opposite Mexico in recent months. So he takes you into the scene down at the border, and he brings the reader into the story. Mr. Trump flew to this dusty community outside San Diego to highlight the progress, however halting, that he said was finally being made towards building his wall. And so you see more of the style of the writer. This is a very accomplished journalist writing like this, but I chose this so you can see what the possibilities are. You can see the style of the writer, but you're not hearing the writer's opinion about the events. He's not telling you what he thinks about President Trump, whether he thinks it's a good idea or not. You don't want to know what the journalist thinks. You want the journalist to give you what the events were. And so this is a slightly more flexible lead, but it's still doing the basic things that news writing, journalism writing needs to do. So let's keep going. All right. So here's some more of this story. Mr. Trump flew to this dusty community outside San Diego on a hot, sunny day to highlight the progress, however halting, that he said was finally being made after a couple of years of frustration and political opposition. Like a builder showing off a new tower in New York, he talked in detail about the new barrier. And he explained how the 30-foot slats are erected with rebar inside. And he gives you a picture of President Trump, who has spent most of his life building buildings in his element, boasting about the way this would be the most impenetrable wall in the world. And then he has a quote from the president, and he gives you some facts further down about the progress that's been made. So let's go on to the next slide so we can summarize that. The basics of the news story are still the same. Even though it's a more narrative approach, the basics are still here. He has confirmed facts that Peter has confirmed by talking to the president, his staff, the Border Patrol. He knows this is true. Of 500 miles that President Trump promised to build, only 66 miles of replacement barriers have been built so far. That explains to you why President Trump has been frustrated about this. This is his signature initiative, and so far they haven't built a single mile of new wall. He has quotes from President Trump that are very expressive. The quote says, "When this is completed," he added, "there won't be a border anywhere like this." So with his usual bravado and enthusiasm about this wall, he's quoting, you hear it directly from the president himself. And Peter has included different perspectives. He says what President Trump sees as security, of course, is viewed much differently by others. And he gives you the arguments of people who say that it's a waste of money, that it's not effective building a wall to stop illegal crossings because people don't come to the places where the wall has been built. So you still have the basic of a news story. The basics are still the same here. So let's keep going. All right, this is a feature story that I wrote in 2016. So now I'm taking you back in time a little bit to show you something that I wrote myself. This is November 19th, 2016, and a wonderful colleague of mine who is based in Los Angeles named Jenny Medina co-wrote this story with me. And this is a story about young immigrants who came to the United States when they were children. Sometimes they call themselves, often they call themselves dreamers. And this is November 19th, 2016. So President Trump has been elected, but he has not yet taken office. This is a story about what the reaction was to his election before the time when he took office. So let's go and see what we said in this story. Brought to the United States from Venezuela as a toddler, Carlos Roa was among the first undocumented immigrants to be protected from deportation under a program President Obama set up in 2012 by executive action. Since then, Mr. Roa, now 29, has put himself through college and is training to be an architect, drafting blueprints at a Chicago firm. Here's some more of this story that we wrote. With deep roots in the United States and with many supporters in civil rights groups, universities, and city governments already mobilizing to shield them, many who came here as youth said they were prepared to fight efforts to end the program or expel them from the country. And then I have a quote from Carlos who says, "I've been here for 27 years and I'm not going anywhere." Okay, let's go to the next slide and we'll break down this story. So why do we call this a feature story? Well, a feature story doesn't center on any one news event. The first stories we saw, when there was a police shooting. The second story, the president went to the wall at San Diego. This is now a story that there's not one news event that is creating this story. A feature story often will begin with some kind of personal story or an anecdote. It doesn't have to be what we call a hard news lead, where you're just in a urgent hurry to get the most important news at the top of the story. A feature story is generally reporting on a trend or a longer saga of some sort or another, as opposed to something that's just giving you the basic news. But let's keep going. The basics are still the same. A feature story has to be accurate. I mean, you can't, even though you're writing about a narration of somebody's life or some conflict, or you're exposing some wrong that was done in an investigative piece, you still have to check and confirm the facts. You can't go halfway on that. The story has to be accurate. You have to be double checking everything to make sure that it's accurate and true to the best of your knowledge. A feature story still, in most cases, unless you're a very brilliant writer, you need to think before you write, because you need to summarize at the top of the story what the story is going to tell you. People don't want to, your reader doesn't want to wait for 400 or 500 words to find out why they're reading this story. In this case, the paragraph in question says, with the election of Donald J. Trump as president, Mr. Roa and 750,000 other immigrants in the program who came to the United States as children have been swept up in a wave of anxiety, worrying about losing the progress they have made and being forced back into the underground or even deported. So it's not the first graph, but high up in the story, you get a paragraph that tells you what you're going to be reading. It includes different perspectives. You can't just tell the story. I can't just tell the story of Carlos Roa. If you read the whole story, you'll see that the administration's perspective, the president-elect's perspective, the advocacy groups and what they have to say. There are a lot of different voices that we brought to this story. And a feature story, even though it's about a complicated saga or something that might be a little difficult to understand, what is the situation of the Dreamers? What's the policy that President Trump is proposing when he takes office? It still can be told in plain language. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize level writer to be able to do journalism writing. The simpler the language, in many cases, the better. Simple language allows the story to come through. It allows the actors to come through. The journalist is not imposing himself or herself on the story. So next slide. So why do I want to write like a journalist? Well, if you learn to write like a journalist, you will learn to think before you write. Journalism writing requires you to understand the whole story before you start to write. It requires you to really summarize and clarify your thoughts. You will learn to tell the main point at the top of the story. Again, this is an exercise in thinking and writing that is very useful. You have to clarify your thoughts and make decisions about what's the main point you want to communicate right at the top of the story. You'll learn how to pack a lot of information into 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs, which is a very useful skill. You will learn the power of plain language. Like I said before, you don't have to be Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Julia Alvarez to write like a journalist. The words, the language that you have, you can use that to write like a journalist. In fact, plain language is better for journalism. You just want to put the facts out there. You're not trying to make your mark on the story. You're trying to tell the story to other people. You'll learn how to use sources, and particularly not only you'll learn how to make judgments about who's giving you good information and who isn't, but you'll learn how to talk to sources who have different perspectives. And by hearing the different ways that people see something, you can get closer to the truth very often. And you will learn how to check and confirm facts, which is a skill that goes way beyond journalism in your life. And so in general, there are a lot of very useful things that you can learn by learning how to write like a journalist. But the best thing, as you'll see in the last slide, is that if you learn to write like a journalist, you can tell stories. You can tell your story. You can tell other people's stories. And that's really fun.
Thank you, Julia, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. We are most appreciative.